The arena was alive with noise. Thousands of alien voices thundered together, shaking the ground with laughter and cheers. The wide stone walls carried the sound until it seemed like the whole world was mocking one man. In the middle of that vast circle of sand stood Daniel, a human. His armor looked old, patched with scratches and dents. His sword was dull, a blade that had clearly seen too many battles and not enough care. Among the hundreds of warriors chosen for this tournament, he looked the least impressive. The announcer's voice carried through the crowd, naming each fighter who had entered before him. Giant-scaled beasts from the Zoroth tribes, armored lizard-like champions with their golden shields. Tall insectoids with blades for arms, clicking their mandibles as they accepted the crowd's worship. Even a towering warlord from the Krith, Dominion, with a hammer taller than Daniel himself. All of them had been cheered, admired, and praised. And then came Daniel. The moment his name was called, the crowd had laughed. Not a cheer, not even a polite clap. Just laughter, cruel and endless. The last in line, one voice shouted from the seats above. Smallest of the weak, another cried out. Some even waved broken sticks, mocking his weapon as if the whole galaxy had decided to shame him at once. But Daniel didn't lower his head. His shoulders didn't sag. His steps didn't slow. He simply walked onto the sand, standing in the center with calm eyes. His face showed no anger, no shame, only patience. He was used to this. He had been underestimated his whole life, and it no longer cut him as it once had. Aliens leaned toward each other, whispering, making jokes at his expense. Some wondered if humans had truly evolved on a world so dangerous, or if they had exaggerated their past. Looking at him now, so small, so fragile, no one believed he could last even a moment in the arena. But Daniel wasn't here to make them believe. He was here to prove it. The arena's massive gates opened with a heavy rumble. Through the shadows stepped the champion of this round. He was a giant even among his own people, the great warrior called Vrax. His scales gleamed in the torchlight, dark green edged with silver, his body covered in ceremonial armor of iron and bone. Each step he took shook the sand, his claws dragging lines in the ground. The crowd roared his name, Vrax, 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 until the air itself seemed to tremble. Daniel looked up at him without fear. His expression remained the same, calm and steady, as if he had expected this all along. Vrax's eyes narrowed. He tilted his head, as though trying to understand why his opponent did not shake, did not tremble, did not show the usual fear. Human. Vrax growled, his voice deep enough to echo off the arena walls. You are the last in line, the weakest offering. Why do you stand before me? Daniel smiled slightly, though his voice was quiet. Because I know how the fight ends. The crowd burst into laughter again. They thought it arrogance, foolishness. They thought the little human was pretending to be brave when he was about to be crushed. But Daniel's mind was calm. He remembered his training, years of it, away from lights and noise. He remembered nights under alien skies, where he had fought not for glory, but survival. He thought of his homeworld, Earth, a place where storms, wild beasts, and endless trials shaped every generation. Humanity had been called weak before many times. They were smaller, shorter-lived, less armored than the galaxy's predators. But they had something else, a stubbornness that never broke. Daniel knew Vrax was stronger, faster, and larger, but strength alone never guaranteed victory. Daniel's people had learned that countless times in their history. The duel began with the sound of a deep horn. The gates locked, and the arena filled with silence for just a breath. Then Vrax lunged. The giant's claws swung down like falling towers, smashing into the sand where Daniel had been standing a heartbeat before. The ground cracked, sand spraying into the air. Gasps rose from the crowd as the human rolled aside, light on his feet. He was not fast enough to escape forever, they thought. No one could outrun Vrax's power, but Daniel wasn't running to escape. He was watching, measuring, learning. Every strike told him something. Every movement showed him a rhythm. He was not fighting the champion yet. He was learning him. Vrax laughed as he struck again and again, each blow landing closer to the human's body. He thought Daniel's dodges were desperation, that the human was barely surviving. What he didn't see was Daniel's eyes, sharp and focused, watching every motion with purpose. Minutes passed, though to the crowd it felt like seconds. The fight had only begun, and already whispers filled the seats. Why is the human still standing? He should have been crushed. Is he lucky, or... Daniel's armor was scratched, his shield dented. His sword had yet to strike even once, but he remained on his feet. His breath came steady, his steps sure. He did not panic, and that alone made the crowd uneasy. Finally, Vrax stopped, his chest rising with effort. He stared down at the human, tilting his head again. "You have lasted longer than I thought," he growled, "but no longer." Daniel raised his sword, though the edge looked dull. His smile returned. The fight isn't decided by who looks strongest. It's decided by who endures. The crowd laughed again, though this time their voices were not as loud. Somewhere in the stands, silence began to spread. For the first time, some wondered, could the human truly believe his words? The horn sounded, again, marking the round's pause. The announcer declared the fight would continue after a short rest, to give the champion time to prepare his finishing strike. The crowd roared approval, ready to see blood. Daniel lowered his sword, standing still in the middle of the sand. His eyes wandered across the arena, but not to the crowd, not to the noise. He was thinking, planning. His patience was the shield he trusted most, stronger than the broken iron strapped to his arm. He knew how they saw him, weak, small, unworthy, but that was exactly why they would never expect what came next. Daniel smiled again, calm as ever. The arena lights burned above him, and his shadow stretched long across the sand. The first part of the fight had ended, but the real battle had not yet begun, and when it did, Daniel already knew how it would end. The break was short, but for Daniel it was enough. He stood still in the arena, eyes calm, body steady, breathing measured. The crowd shouted insults, jokes, and mock cheers, but none of it touched him. He had learned long ago that noise was just noise. It could not hurt him unless he let it inside. Across from him, the great champion Vrax stood like a mountain. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, steam drifting from his nostrils. The champion was huge, strong, and proud. He had crushed opponents from 20 different species. His victories were carved into his armor, each mark a symbol of battles won. But something unsettled him. The human still stood. The last in line, the one the crowd had laughed at, had survived his first assault. No other opponent had lasted this long without bleeding. When the horn sounded again, the fight resumed. Vrax moved first, his claws swinging in wide arcs. Each strike was fast for his size, the kind of speed that had destroyed countless warriors. Daniel ducked, sidestepped, and rolled. The sand sprayed under his boots, but he never fell. His shield was cracked and his sword dull, yet his movements carried purpose. The crowd laughed at first, thinking the human's dodges were luck, but as the fight went on, the laughter began to fade. Daniel wasn't stumbling. He wasn't panicking. Every step was controlled, every motion precise. He was not fighting Vrax with brute force. He was testing him. Vrax growled as his claws struck the ground again, splitting the stone beneath the sand. Dust rose into the air, clouding vision. Daniel darted aside, using the cover to disappear from the champion's direct sight. When the dust cleared, he was already at a new angle, forcing Vrax to turn. The champion snarled, "Do you run from me, human?" Daniel's voice was calm, steady, and clear enough for the closest rows of aliens to hear. "No, I wait for you." The crowd erupted. Some cheered the words, impressed by the human's boldness. Others jeered louder, calling it arrogance. But many fell silent, eyes watching with new curiosity. The small human was not begging for mercy. He was speaking as though he had a plan, Vrax roared and charged, his heavy steps shaking the ground. Daniel's shield shattered under the force of a strike, splintering into useless pieces. He tossed it aside without hesitation, gripping his sword with both hands. The champion lifted his massive weapon, a jagged spear tipped with a blade of bone. The air hummed as it cut down, fast as lightning. Daniel barely avoided the strike, rolling under the spear and rising to his feet. He slashed at Vrax's leg, but the dull blade barely scratched the champion's armor. The crowd cheered Vrax, but their cheers were mixed now with murmurs of awe at the human's endurance. He had taken nothing but glancing blows, yet he still stood. His eyes, sharp and calm, never left his opponent. Minutes stretched into long breaths of battle. Vrax struck again and again, his attacks heavier each time. But Daniel refused to fall. He twisted, ducked, and let the champion's own strength tire him. Sweat covered Daniel's brow, but his breathing remained controlled. Vrax grew angry. His strikes lost their rhythm. His voice thundered across the arena. "Why will you not break? Why will you not fall?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Because I know how the fight ends." The crowd hushed for a moment. They had heard those words before, at the start of the duel. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. The duel shifted. Daniel stopped dodging so far from each strike. Now he moved only just enough. A claw swept past his face with the width of a finger to spare. A spear tip crashed into the sand where his foot had been a heartbeat earlier. He was not fleeing anymore. He was guiding. The crowd realized it slowly. His steps had meaning. He was drawing the champion into patterns, pushing him toward certain positions. The arena was wide, but every inch of it became part of Daniel's quiet plan. Vrax roared in fury, his tail lashing out. It slammed against Daniel's chest, throwing him back across the sand. The human landed hard, his sword clattering beside him. The crowd gasped, some shouting in triumph for the champion, others in despair for the human. But Daniel rose, slowly, painfully, yet surely. His breath was heavy, his chest ached, but his smile returned. He picked up his sword and pointed it toward Vrax. The champion hesitated. Something in that smile unsettled him more than any wound ever could. The crowd began to change. No longer did they laugh as loudly. No longer did they mock. Some began to chant Daniel's name, though uncertainly at first. Others whispered to one another, asking how he could endure so much. For the first time in countless battles, Vrax felt the weight of doubt pressing into his chest. The crowd was not fully his anymore. Their eyes had turned, drawn to the human who refused to break. Vrax snarled, his scales gleaming with sweat and dust. "Enough of this, I will end you now." He raised his spear for a final crushing strike. The weapon glowed faintly as energy built inside it, the kind of strike meant to finish opponents in one blow. The crowd roared in expectation. Daniel stood, calmly, watching, waiting. His grip on his sword tightened. His legs bent slightly, ready to move. His eyes stayed locked on the champion, never blinking. He whispered softly, though perhaps only to himself. "Yes. Show me everything." The champion charged, his spear raised high. The sand shook under his steps, the ground splitting with each stride. His roar filled the arena as he brought the weapon down with all his strength. The sand exploded where it struck, a cloud of dust rising high. For a moment, the crowd thought it was over. The human must be gone. No one could withstand that. But then the dust cleared, and Daniel was still there. He had rolled at the last moment, the spear smashing into the ground inches away. His armor was torn, his body bruised, but he still stood. He looked at Vrax with that same steady smile. The crowd gasped, then roared. Not in laughter this time, but in excitement. Half of them cheered for the champion, the other half for the human. For the first time, the arena was divided. Vrax growled, but doubt had entered his eyes. His strikes were not so certain anymore. His strength was still great, but his rhythm was broken. He had faced warriors stronger than Daniel, faster, deadlier, but none had ever endured like this. None had smiled in the face of his power. Daniel, though weary and battered, stood tall. His sword hung loosely in his hand, but his spirit was unshaken. He did not need the crowd's cheers, though he had them now. He only needed patience. The duel was not finished. The champion still towered above him, and the fight could still go either way. But in Daniel's heart, the path was already clear. He had tested the champion. He had seen his strength, his weakness, his rage. The end was not far, and Daniel still smiled, knowing how the fight would end. The duel stretched longer than anyone expected. For most fights in the arena, the outcome was decided within minutes. Warriors came in, struck fast, and claimed victory. But this battle between Daniel and the champion was different. The crowd felt it in their bones. This was not just strength against weakness. This was endurance against pride. Vrax's heavy breaths echoed across the sand. His chest rose and fell, his scales damp with sweat. He was not yet beaten, but he was no longer fresh. The fight had demanded more of him than he admitted. He had crushed warriors larger than Daniel with less effort, but the human was still standing. Daniel's body ached. His arm throbbed from holding the sword. His chest burned where the champion's tail had struck him, and his legs trembled with each step. But his eyes remained clear. His face still wore that same calm smile. He had been through worse. He had survived worse. This was not the end. It was only the middle. The crowd watched in silence as the two circled each other. Sand shifted under Daniel's boots, crunching softly with every careful step. Vrax dragged his spear along the ground, the sharp edge cutting lines into the arena floor. "Why do you delay, human?" Vrax growled, his voice low and filled with anger. "Strike me if you dare, or admit you are too weak to fight." Daniel's voice was calm. "You want me to play your game, but I play my own." The crowd gasped at his boldness. No one spoke to the champion that way. But Daniel wasn't mocking. He was simply speaking the truth. The duel resumed. Vrax swung his spear in wide arcs, each movement powerful enough to cut stone. But Daniel had stopped running far away from the blows. Instead, he stayed close, dodging with the smallest movements possible. His body bent just enough to avoid the spear's edge, his steps shifting just enough to stay clear. Every near miss made the crowd gasp. Every close escape drew cheers. At first, they thought it luck. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became. Daniel wasn't lucky. He was skilled. And more than that, he was patient. He wasn't trying to win with a single strike. He wasn't trying to overpower the champion. He was waiting for mistakes. Vrax's fury grew. His strikes came faster, harder, but with each swing, he lost a little more control. His roars shook the arena. His claws dug furrows into the sand. His tail lashed wildly. Daniel let it happen. He let the champion waste his strength, tire his body, and feed his rage. The crowd began to notice. Whispers spread among the seats. "Look at the human. He moves with purpose. The champion is slowing down. No. Can it be? Could the small one actually win?" For the first time, the laughter was gone. Now there was only tension. Daniel began to test his blade. He swung lightly at Vrax's arms, his legs, even the tail that lashed out. His dull sword could not pierce the thick armor, but each strike left faint marks. They were not wounds, but reminders. Warnings. Vrax growled with each scratch, his pride wounded more than his body. "You think those tiny cuts mean anything?" he roared. Daniel answered with a steady voice. "They mean I can touch you. And if I can touch you, I can end this." The crowd erupted. Some cheered Daniel's words, others shouted in disbelief. But all of them watched with eyes wide and hearts racing. The human had become more than a joke. He had become a threat. The champion's frustration boiled over. He slammed his spear into the ground, sending a shockwave across the sand. Daniel stumbled back but kept his balance. Vrax charged, his claws swinging wildly. Daniel ducked under the first strike, twisted past the second, and let the third pass over his head. He guided his steps carefully, leading Vrax in circles, forcing him to strike again and again at empty air. The champion roared, his voice breaking with rage. He swung harder, faster, until at last his claw caught in the cracks of the arena floor. For a moment he struggled to free it. That moment was all Daniel needed. He struck. His dull sword slashed across the champion's arm, not cutting deep, but enough to draw a thin line of blood. The crowd exploded with noise. Gasps, cheers, and cries filled the air. A human had struck the champion. It was not a killing blow, but it was proof. Proof that the weak could wound the strong. Vrax yanked his arm free, his eyes blazing with fury. He swung again, but now his strikes were unsteady. His pride had been wounded as much as his flesh. Daniel's smile returned, calm and certain. "You're not fighting me anymore," he said softly. "You're fighting yourself." The words cut deeper than any blade. The champion's movements grew wilder, his steps heavier. The more he tried to crush the human, the more he exposed himself. Daniel's strikes grew bolder. He slashed at the champion's legs, scratched at his chest, and nicked at his tail. Each strike was small, but each strike carried meaning. They were reminders that the human endured, that the human could not be ignored. The crowd began to chant. At first it was scattered, uncertain, but then it grew louder, stronger. Half the voices called for the champion. The other half, shockingly, called for Daniel. "Daniel! Daniel! Daniel!" The sound filled the arena, echoing off the walls, rattling in the ears of every warrior present. For the first time, the champion was not the only name honored. Vrax's fury burned hotter. He raised his spear high and brought it down with all his strength. Daniel sidestepped at the last moment, letting the weapon crash into the stone. The spear cracked, its blade breaking with a sharp snap. The crowd gasped in disbelief. The champion's weapon broken? Such a thing had never happened before. Daniel stood a few steps away, his sword in hand, his smile still calm. "Even the strongest weapon breaks when pushed too hard," he said. The arena fell silent for a breath. Then the crowd roared louder than ever, the noise shaking the very ground. Vrax's fury turned into desperation. His claws swung in wild arcs, his tail lashed with reckless force. But Daniel had already seen enough. He had measured the champion. He had tested his limits. Now every move was clearer. Every strike was easier to predict. Daniel darted closer, moving inside the champion's reach. His sword struck again and again, each blow aimed at weak spots, the gaps in armor, the joints, the places no one else dared to aim. His blade was dull, but persistence made up for sharpness. Vrax staggered back, his body marked with scratches, his pride shattered. His roars grew weaker, his movements slower. The unstoppable champion had been slowed by a man the crowd once mocked. Daniel stood tall, his chest heaving, his body bruised, but his spirit unbroken. The crowd's chants filled the air, half for the champion, half for the human. The duel was no longer a joke. It was history in the making. As the horn sounded to mark the pause of the round, the crowd erupted once more. They shouted Daniel's name with growing strength, their voices rising like thunder. Vrax glared at him with burning eyes, his pride bleeding with every scratch on his body. "You cannot win, human," he growled, his voice heavy with rage. Daniel's reply was simple, steady, and filled with certainty. "The fight isn't over, but I already know how it ends." The crowd roared again, their voices shaking the arena. The duel was far from finished, but the balance had shifted. The human was no longer the weakest. He was a challenger, a threat, a warrior who had turned tricks of survival into weapons of victory. And as Daniel stood in the center of the sand, smiling faintly, the galaxy watched in awe. The arena no longer sounded the same. When Daniel had first walked onto the sand, the noise had been cruel, full of laughter and mockery. He had been the last in line, the weakest, the one meant to be crushed for amusement. Now, the noise had changed. The laughter was gone. The crowd was divided, half shouting for Vrax, their legendary champion, and half chanting Daniel's name, their voices growing stronger with every passing breath. The horn had sounded for the round to continue. Dust hung in the air, carrying the heat of the fight. The ground was cracked where Vrax's spear had broken, pieces of stone scattered across the arena floor. Daniel stood tall in the middle, battered but steady, his sword still gripped firmly. His armor was dented and his body bruised, yet his calm smile remained. Vrax, on the other hand, was no longer untouchable. His pride was wounded, his scales were marked with scratches, and his once perfect rhythm had fallen apart. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his eyes burning with fury and disbelief. Never before had a fight dragged on this long against a human. Never before had his strikes failed to end it quickly. The crowd leaned forward as the champion roared, shaking the walls of the arena. "You think small cuts will bring me down? You are nothing compared to me." His voice echoed like thunder, but it no longer sounded invincible. Daniel's voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the sand. "The bigger they are, the harder they fall." The words made the crowd erupt with noise, cheers, laughter, and gasps. For the first time, someone had dared to throw a saying at the champion, but Daniel did not speak to taunt him. He spoke to remind himself that every giant eventually stumbled. Vrax lunged forward, his claws slashing. Daniel moved aside, dodging, narrowly. The champion's strikes grew reckless. His tail swept across the sand, nearly throwing Daniel off his feet. The human stumbled, but he quickly steadied himself. He had expected the rage. He had counted on it. The champion swung his claw again, this time faster, sharper. It struck Daniel's shoulder, tearing a piece of his armor away. The human spun with the force, landing hard on his knees. The crowd gasped, their voices rising, in a storm of noise. For a moment it looked as though Vrax had won, but Daniel pushed himself back up. Slowly, painfully, but surely. He picked up his sword from the sand, dust clinging to the blade. His chest burned, his arm ached, but his eyes never left the champion. His faint smile returned. The sight of that smile enraged Vrax. "You dare smile at me? Even broken, you mock me?" He slammed his foot into the ground, cracking the stone beneath his claws. "Then I will end this once and for all." With a roar, the champion charged. His massive body thundered across the arena, claws raised high, tail whipping behind him. The crowd shouted, their voices a wave of chaos. Everyone expected the human to fall, crushed beneath the strike. But Daniel had been waiting. As Vrax brought his claws down, Daniel twisted aside, letting the strike crash into the cracked stone. The ground shattered under the force, jagged pieces of rock flying through the air. The champion stumbled, his arm caught in the broken stone for a brief moment. That moment was all Daniel needed. He darted forward, driving his sword down onto the champion's trapped arm. The dull blade dug into the gap between scales. It was not deep enough to maim, but it was enough to make Vrax roar in pain. Blood spilled, and the crowd screamed in shock. The champion ripped his arm free, the stone breaking apart. His eyes blazed, with fury, his roar deafening, but he staggered back, holding his wounded arm. For the first time, the galaxy's strongest warrior bled in the arena. Daniel stood tall, his sword dripping with crimson. His breathing was heavy, his body screamed with exhaustion, but his will remained unbroken. He lifted his blade and pointed, it at Vrax, his calm smile unwavering. The crowd exploded, half in wild cheers for Daniel, half in furious shouts for Vrax. The arena shook with the force of their voices. Vrax, panting heavily, glared at the human. "You think this wound means you have won?" His voice was filled with rage, but beneath it a trace of doubt slipped through. Daniel's voice was steady. "It means you can bleed. And if you can bleed, you can lose." The words cut deeper than the sword. Vrax's claws trembled with fury. He rushed forward again, swinging wildly, his strength still great but his focus broken. His strikes tore through the air, smashing into the sand, but Daniel stayed just ahead, dodging and weaving, guiding the champion's movements. Every step Daniel took was planned. He led Vrax across the arena, forcing him into traps of his own anger. The champion swung until his breath grew ragged, his arms heavy, his movements slower. His body was still powerful, but his energy drained with each wasted strike. Daniel waited, watched, and endured. His body shook with fatigue, but he refused to fall. He had survived storms on Earth, battles against beasts larger than himself, and wars that demanded endless patience. This was no different. He only needed to last long enough. Finally, the moment came. Vrax lifted both claws high for one last crushing blow. He brought them down with all his weight, roaring in fury. Daniel rolled aside, the claws smashing into the stone floor. The impact trapped the champion's arms deep in the cracks. He struggled to pull free, but for a brief moment, he was pinned. Daniel rose to his feet, his sword in hand. His body shook, his vision blurred, but his purpose was clear. He ran forward, leaping onto the champion's trapped arm, climbing up toward his massive chest. The crowd gasped in shock as the small human scaled the giant warrior like a predator closing in on prey. With one final swing, Daniel brought his sword down across the champion's chest, right at a gap in the armor. The dull blade dug in deep, enough to draw another roar of pain. The crowd went wild. Some screamed for the champion, others shouted for the human, but none could believe their eyes. The impossible had happened again. The champion was wounded by the weakest fighter. Daniel leapt back to the sand, landing on his feet, though his knees nearly buckled. He raised his sword once more, pointing it at Vrax. His smile returned, faint but certain. The champion ripped his arms free from the stone, his body heaving with fury and pain. He glared at the human, his pride broken, his strength waning. The horn sounded, marking the pause once more. The crowd erupted, their voices a storm of divided loyalty. For the first time in history, the champion's victory was uncertain. As Daniel stood in the center of the arena, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, he looked calm. His body was battered, his armor nearly destroyed, but his spirit shone stronger than ever. He had turned the tide. The fight was no longer one-sided. The human was no longer a joke. He was a warrior who had forced the galaxy's greatest champion to bleed, and as he stood there, his faint smile never leaving, his face, Daniel knew the truth. The end was near. He had endured, he had learned, and now he was ready. The champion had given everything. But Daniel still had one thing left: patience. And patience, he knew, would decide how the fight ends. The horn's echo faded, but the noise of the crowd filled every corner of the arena. What had begun as laughter had become thunder. Some still shouted for Vrax, their proud champion, their unshakable warrior. But just as many voices now cried out for Daniel, the human who refused to fall. The name Daniel rose in waves, breaking against the walls louder and louder. The atmosphere was different. There was no longer certainty in the air. No one knew how the fight would end. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide, their breaths held. This was no longer entertainment. This was history. Daniel stood in the center of the cracked sand, his sword heavy in his hand. His body was bruised and aching, his armor bent and nearly useless, but his eyes were steady. His faint smile remained calm and sure. He had faced storms and beasts before, but never had so many eyes been on him. And still, he felt no fear. Vrax stood across from him, his great chest heaving, blood marking his scales where Daniel's strikes had landed. His once perfect armor was scratched, his once unbreakable spear broken. He still towered like a mountain, his presence fierce and terrible, but his pride had been cut deeply. For the first time in countless battles, the champion's victory was uncertain. The horn sounded again. The final round had begun. Vrax roared, his voice carrying across the entire arena. He charged forward, claws raised, tail whipping the air behind him. His massive frame shook the ground, dust rising under each step. He was still strong, still dangerous, but he no longer moved with the rhythm of a champion. He moved with anger. Daniel did not move at first. He stood calm as stone, his smile never fading. At the last moment, as the claws came crashing down, he stepped aside. The ground split where he had been standing, dust exploding upward. Daniel rolled across the sand and rose quickly, his sword at the ready. The crowd gasped. The human had escaped again, Vrax turned, his tail sweeping across the arena. Daniel ducked low, letting the wind of the strike pass over him. He darted closer, his sword flashing. The blade struck against the champion's leg, cutting into a joint where the armor was weakest. Vrax roared, stumbling a step back. The crowd erupted. Half shouted in fury, half in awe, but all of them were on the edge of their seats. The duel had shifted. The weakest fighter was no longer running. He was attacking. Vrax lashed out again, claws slicing through the air. Daniel dodged, always a step ahead. He struck again, scratching at the gaps in the champion's armor. His sword was dull, but persistence made it sharp. "Stand still, human," Vrax roared, swinging wildly. Daniel's reply was steady, almost gentle. "Why would I do what you want?" The crowd cheered at the words. They could feel it now. The human was no longer fighting to survive. He was guiding the fight, turning the champion's rage against him. Blow after blow shook the arena. Sand flew in clouds, stone cracked beneath their strikes, and still the battle went on. Daniel's body screamed with exhaustion, but his mind remained clear. He had learned the champion's every movement, every habit. He knew when the claws would fall, when the tail would whip, when the steps would stumble. And now, he was waiting for the final mistake. It came when Vrax raised both claws for a crushing strike. He brought them down with the weight of his entire body, roaring with fury. Daniel stepped aside at the last instant. The claws smashed into the ground, sinking deep into the cracks. For a moment, the champion was stuck. Daniel saw his chance. He darted forward, leaping onto the champion's trapped arm, climbing quickly like a predator scaling prey. The crowd screamed in shock. The human was on the champion himself. Vrax roared, trying to shake him off, but Daniel moved fast. He reached the champion's shoulder and swung his sword at the gap in the chest armor. The blade bit deep enough to draw blood crimson against the dark scales. The crowd exploded. The sound was deafening, a storm of disbelief and awe. The champion was wounded again, and this time, the wound was deeper. Daniel leapt down, landing on the sand, his legs nearly buckling. He stood tall, his sword raised, his chest heaving with effort. His faint smile remained. Vrax staggered back, his eyes blazing with fury but shadowed by fear. His claws dripped with blood, his body marked by wounds. He had never faced such a foe, not because of size or strength, but because of spirit. "You cannot win," he shouted, though the words sounded less like truth and more like desperation. Daniel shook his head softly. "I already have." The champion roared and charged once more, throwing his entire body forward. But his strikes were slower now. His breath was heavy, his movements clumsy with exhaustion. Daniel dodged easily, his steps sure. He struck again and again, each blow small but precise, each one reminding the champion that he was not untouchable. Finally, with one last desperate swing, Vrax stumbled. His legs gave way and the mighty champion fell to one knee. The crowd gasped, then roared. The arena shook with their voices. Never before had they seen their champion brought low. Daniel stood before him, his sword raised. He could have finished it then. One strike to the neck, one thrust to the chest, and the fight would be over. But he did not strike. Instead, he stepped forward and pressed the dull edge of his sword lightly against the champion's throat. Not cutting, not killing, simply showing that he could. The crowd fell silent. Thousands of voices stopped at once, waiting, watching. Daniel's faint smile remained. His voice was calm, steady, and strong. "It ends here." The champion's eyes burned with fury, then slowly dimmed with realization. He had been defeated, not by a stronger weapon, not by greater size, but by patience, endurance, and will. He lowered his head, his voice heavy with shame. "You are victorious." The crowd erupted, their cheers shaking the arena like thunder. They shouted Daniel's name, their voices rising higher than they ever had for the champion. "Daniel! Daniel! Daniel!" The sound filled the air, rolling like waves, unstoppable and powerful. Daniel lowered his sword and stepped back. He, did not raise his arms in victory, did not shout, did not boast. He simply stood, calm and steady, his smile faint but certain. He had no need for glory. The fight itself had proven everything. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, declaring Daniel the winner. The words echoed like history being carved in stone. The last in line, the weakest, the one mocked and laughed at, had defeated the greatest champion. As the crowd cheered, Daniel turned away from the center of the arena. He walked slowly toward the gates, his steps heavy but sure. The dust clung to his armor. The blood of the champion marked his blade, but his spirit was untouched. The aliens in the stands bowed their heads in respect. Warriors who had once mocked him now watched in silence, their pride shaken, their beliefs rewritten. They had seen what humanity was capable of. Daniel did not need their praise. He did not need their cheers. He carried something greater. Proof. Proof that humans were more than weak, more than small, more than prey. Proof that patience and endurance could defeat even the mightiest. As he reached the gates, the crowd's cheers still rolling behind him, Daniel allowed himself one last smile. Not for the victory, not for the glory, but for the truth he had always known. The fight had ended just as he expected, and he had smiled, knowing all along how it would.